bona tarda de nou a nom...
Good afternoon again on behalf of the entire team of Pece Negra, ICUB, the Culture Institute of the Town Hall of Barcelona, and Carlos Anand, the Commissioner. And now we're starting another session with another British author, David Peace. He now lives in Tokyo, though. And the title of the spot where we are right now is a cocktail that we have concocted between different titles by David Peace. Port Tokyo, Red Riding United. He is the author of Red Riding Quartet and Yorkshire, and he also the Tokyo trilogy. And in 2015 we received Maldito United in Spanish, about a key figure in British football in the 70s. And out of all of these titles we've made this mix, and this is now Port Tokyo Red Riding United. As to the quartets that I mentioned, the Yorkshire and Red Riding Quartet, he describes a series of sex criminals, a grey, bleak environment, pessimism, but also a lot of originality, which changed the way in which we saw crime fiction in the UK. And now in Tokyo, he's an English teacher after having done that in Istanbul and France, and he also makes a depiction of the society, the harsh society, and the Japan of after the war. GB84 is about the standoff between Margaret Thatcher and the British miners, and a person who really knows all of these books well is Laura Fernandez, journalist at El País, where she writes about criminal fiction. And we must say that she's been doing some interviews for us in the past few days, and she's a writer as well, such as Chica Zombie, Show de Grossman, Cornerland, different books that she wrote and that we recommend. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. For me, it is a huge pleasure to be here with David today. I think there isn't a single crime fiction writer or a single writer who doesn't love David Peace one way or another. His name is mentioned everywhere nowadays, so much that it seems as if he had always been there, not just for writers but for readers as well, especially for those who want to be in a different time, in a different place, but also want to understand this different time and different place. Because I believe that his novels are treatises that explore the soul of British society from the Thatcher era, this dehumanized, bleak society, more individualistic. So reading his books is so immersive, and it's dark and enlightening at the same time, because I think he asks the right questions and he finds all the answers. Nobody escapes a David Peace novel. Nobody stays the same after reading his novels. We become wiser, we suffer, but we're fascinated as well. And as Voltaire said at the beginning, the quote at the beginning of the last novel of the Red Riding Quartet, story doesn't repeat itself, men do. Mr. Peace, I wanted to start by asking about that quote and whether it is real. Story does not repeat itself, men do.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. The question is whether men repeat themselves and not the story. Was that the question? Well, I mean, there was I think throughout the work I've done, there is a certain repetition, and it is the repetition of the actions of men. Men doing bad things again and again.
All of this will be a journey through the work of David Peace. So I would like for you to start by telling us about the beginning of everything, the Red Riding Quartet. How did it begin? It started well before you wrote it, as far as I know, because of other times we've spoken in the past. It started when you were about 10 and you were obsessed with Sherlock Holmes, and you wanted to discover who the Yorkshire Ripper was. You wanted to discover it yourself. Was that the case? Is that true?
Well, yeah, that's true. So the first books that I really fell in love with were the Sherlock Holmes novels, and so I was about 8 to 9, 10 years old when I was reading them all, and it was unfortunately also at the time of the serial killings that became known as the work of the Yorkshire Ripper, and I mean, these two things, reading these books and then reading the newspapers and watching the news, led me really actually not to try to write, but to try to even myself solve the case. So I would cut out I cut out the clippings from the two. We'd got two different newspapers. I cut out those clippings and had a kind of office in the garden shed, and sorry, I mean I'm not sure this is interesting really, but they had this shed in which I collected all the information and had as much of the I mean, it's actually, now I'm telling you, it doesn't sound such a good story, but they had I had even the pictures from the crime scene on the wall of the garden shed. And trying to solve the case, which I mean, it sounds, which is ridiculous because it was a very, very terrible and tragic case that was unfolding. But that was how I became, that was where certainly what the correspondence of reading the crime fiction and then the case, and then not wanting to write about it, but to solve it. And then that case continued, I think, for very many people who grew up in the north of England at that time, and I know this, it's not only me, I mean, many people were quite obsessed with it, and it never really went away. And so even, I began to write, and I was writing all through, like when I was a teenager and when I went to Manchester to university, and I was writing things around or to do with the Yorkshire Ripper case, but then it wasn't until I came to Tokyo in 94, and even with 1974, the first book, the Yorkshire Ripper only makes a very a shadowy. There's one scene in that book where there's a lorry driver who gets out of it, which in my mind was the Yorkshire Ripper. But it was only then with 1977, which would have been I would have been writing about 96, that I actually started to write it in properly in fiction, although I tried before. Yeah.
And why do you think that not only you were obsessed, but the entire society was obsessed with the Ripper? Because when you complete the Red Riding Quarter as a reader, you see a before and an after, the beginning of the Thatcher era. And this explained these crimes, the reason behind these crimes. It explains the change in the government, in society, and this all seems to explain the reason behind those crimes. This is maybe why the entire society was shocked. Maybe the English society felt a bit guilty.
Probably not guilty enough, actually. I mean, I want, as I was writing 1970, so just to back up a little bit, so I'd written a huge, like 350,000 word novel when I was in Manchester, when I was at university, and then when I was unemployed. And this book got rejected by literally every single publisher in the UK. Like, they said no, and not only did they say no, but they said, some of them even said, don't ever send anything again. Like, that's it, please. Forget it. And I even tried writing plays, and the reaction was even worse. Really, this is something you shouldn't do. And even film scripts. And so I really did think that maybe I wasn't cut out for this, really, or at least, I was never going to stop writing, but I think I should stop sending it out, I thought. So I went to Istanbul and I was in Istanbul for 2 years, and during that 2 years, I didn't write anything with a mind to making it into like a novel or poems or anything that would be published. And I actually think that 2-year period of not doing anything with any consideration was very important in retrospect, but at the time it was a very depressing period. When I came to Tokyo, I didn't. This is '94. I didn't know anybody, and I was just going to work and coming home, and I didn't. And I, this is all as everybody knows, pre-internet, anything like this. So there was a very limited amount of. There was a second-hand bookshop and a very limited amount of English language books, and. I'd already read James Ellroy's LA Quartet, but somebody had also put them in this second-hand bookshop, so I thought, great, I'll read them again. And when I finished reading them again, and there was nothing else in the bookshop that I wanted, and I started to read it again, and then I thought, actually, what I want to do is I want to read a book about the time and place I grew up that is would be something as good as Ellroy, right? And so I then thought, okay, I'm going to start to do this. And so I began then to write the book that became 1974. And really, the only thing I was thinking of was to write the best crime novel I could for me. And then my father came to stay with me in Tokyo. Like 95 or something, and one day it was raining really heavily, and it was just a very small room, and he stayed in the room, and I went to work, and he read the longhand what was the beginnings of 1974, and he said, well, this is actually you should send this out. And I said no, because the last time I sent it out, because it was a very upsetting experience. I joke about it now, saying I've been rejected by everybody, but actually it was a little humiliating. And so I thought, and then when he went back to England, he sent me a couple of novels published by Serpent's Tail, and this sounds really, really arrogant, but when I was reading these two novels, I actually thought that 1974 was better than these two novels, and so I sent. Also then I wanted to type up, because it was longhand, so I wanted to type it up. So I typed up 1974, and this is I suppose the arrogance of youth. But I wrote a cover letter to Serpent's Tail, sending the first 3 chapters of 1974, and I said, this is I think this is at least as good as what you're publishing. So I hope you like it, and they sent me in those days they sent me a fax, they sent me a fax saying you're right. Where's the rest of it? So that's but to answer but the 74 though wasn't the thing about 74 was as I was writing it again it was this influence of Ellroy, but I thought I do want to go on, and now I have a lot of problems with 74 because I made up the crimes. It's a real place and a real time. It's historically accurate, apart from these horrific child murders, which now have, as somebody who's like 52 who's got grown-up children now, I really think like what was I really struggle to understand why I would think I would need to write that kind of book, really. But 77. I was beginning, as I was writing 74, I knew I was going to write 77 and then on to 80, because what I knew I really wanted to write about was the Yorkshire Ripper. And to answer your question eventually, what I wanted to know, everybody knows who did those crimes, so there's no mystery as to the who. But to me, it was how did these crimes occur in this time and place. It was not the Scottish Ripper, it was not the Cornish Ripper, it was not the Catalonian Ripper, it was the Yorkshire Ripper in the north of England at that time. And I wanted to know why that happened, and that was the motivation to write the books, to understand what was there a culpability in that society?
Y la respuesta leyendo.
And the answer is that partially yes. There was this guilt.
Yeah, I mean, I would never, for 1 minute, try to, Peter Sutcliffe, a man who was found guilty of those 13 murders, and possibly there are some, but and there are many attacks. I'm not, he takes responsibility for the actions, but certainly the police investigation and the press reporting of it, I think played a huge part, which is possibly too detailed and long-winded to go into now, but a huge part in at least distracting the public from, there was enough evidence and enough people had come forward to say this person should be interviewed, this person, and he was interviewed on a number of occasions, but the police had constructed for themselves a narrative of what this man was like. They had constructed a narrative of the type of women he attacked, and this was also then, the press had fed into this. I mean, the very phrase, the Yorkshire Ripper, this is why the book details, 77 details, this character Jack Whitehead, who's a fictionalized version of a journalist who comes up with this phrase. And, immediately it then gives you this kind of Jack the Ripper, it's prostitution, it's decay, it's the working class, it's this kind of, and so there was this image in the mind of the police, and which when they received a series of letters which were mimics of the Jack the Ripper, the original Victorian letters, and when they get this tape that sort of is echoing these phrases, they believe it because they've constructed the wrong narrative. And the press played a part in that, but also there's no getting around the fact that the police and the press also grew up in the same very, very masculine, sexist culture in which women were casually, routinely, even with affection, referred to as cows. It was not, I'm not saying my father, but it was not uncommon to hear men refer to their wives as cows and actually thinking it was a term of affection. Prostitutes were there was very limited sympathy for the original, the initial victims were women who were prostitutes or sometimes prostitutes, not prostitutes. There was very limited public sympathy for them, as if they'd somehow asked for this. And that society then allowed him to do the things he did for so long with impunity, and also the very environment in which this took place. This is this is the North in the midst of the recession of the 1970s, where industrial spaces were empty, where there was lots of wasteland and there was a lot of dark spaces where men could attack and kill women. Which, if you go to Leeds, not that it's wonderful, but it's not a place. It's a more at that time it was a particularly run down and neglected place. But again, allowed the spaces were there for these things to happen in a society that allowed this kind of thing to happen almost. But he is the man ultimately responsible. Yeah.
And now that you were talking about the media and how they directed the public opinion, what's fascinating about your novels is the way in which they're built. They are like a prayer, a mantra. There's a repetition of sentences, repetition of paragraphs, and also interruption, or there are newspaper articles, radio speeches, so interruption of the reality that is being told, the reality that is taking place. And at the same time, many different voices and different points of view. In this book, published here last year, beginning of last year, There are at least 7 different viewpoints, and in Red Riding Quartet, the book moves forward in such a way that we have one voice in the first one, then 2 voices, then 3 voices, 4 voices in the fourth one, and in the end it's like a classical tragedy with many different voices. I'm fascinated by the way you do this, and I want to know a bit about that, because you say you handwrite, so how do you build all of this style? How do you create a novel like this, a novel which is so powerful in the end, and that makes the reader, you're not only a reader or a spectator, you're in the story, you're reading the newspapers as a reader, you're listening to the guy thinking, you're everywhere as a reader. It's as if you were inside the novel itself. So how do you do that?
Well, I think it's changed. I think that I mean, to me, looking back, say, at the Red Riding Quartet, there's a kind of logical progression. You know, there's a logical progression where it's 1974 is a straightforward first-person narrative crime novel. Although when I originally began writing it, it was in the third person, and then I went back and changed it because I thought the first person gave it a greater intensity, and I thought that it was important. But there was various things that made me decide to rewrite it into the first person. 1977 was, so it was like 2 alternating first-person narratives, and that was tricky to do. But I thought I could, differentiate between the voices strongly enough. And then at the end of 1977, there's a scene where the character Jack Whitehead is about to have his where he has a hole drilled in, had a hole in his head, and he has these visions, and there was this kind of almost stream of consciousness text, and that gave me the confidence then to write the kind of blocks of text, which I call the transmission pieces, in 1980, and 1983 was an attempt then to use like a first, a second, and a third person. So it's just kind of gone on in a way. There's been to me, looking back, there's been a logical development. I think, though, with GB84, there was and the book since, it's been a little bit more conscious. Like with GB84, the issue. So, first of all, GB80, the miners' strike. So, for better or for worse, I grew up, first during the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry. And then for 1 year, from 1980 through to 1985, was the miners' strike, which was the most intense and divisive thing that had happened, I would say, to Britain since the war, and it dominated the news, conversation, media. Like 2 great uncles of mine died in mining accidents, like a long time before I was born, but their names are on the monument. Everybody in the area I grew up in has connections or family connected to mining. At the time of the strike, I was 17, and I was doing what we call in England A-levels, which is your last 2 years of high school or whatever. And my parents were teaching, and the kids they were teaching were children of miners. I was at school with children of like at this high school with children of miners. It was everybody was touched by the strike involved literally on a day-to-day level. There was tens of thousands of miners on strike. There was a handful, or in some areas more, thousands breaking the strike. There were then tens of thousands of people employed by the coal mining board. There was the police, there was the government, there was the civil servants, then there are the shopkeepers, school teachers, the communities. You're talking, hundreds of thousands, millions of people that were directly day-to-day involved in this strike. Now, if you go there now, all those people will have stories. And so I wanted, originally, the Red Riding Quartet was going to end with the strike. It was going to be the last book of so I was writing 77, 80, I thought that maybe the fourth book of a quartet would be the miners' strike because of the, similar places. In real life, similar police officers were people involved in the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, then became involved in the miners' strike. But I just thought in the end, I couldn't tack this in a way onto the end of the quartet. And also, at the same time, I realised that the year 1983 was a very pivotal year. The elections in 1983, when Margaret Thatcher was re-elected, were in a way when the British population, when the people who voted for her, and they were the winning majority, really gave her then carte blanche to attack the trade union movement. So 83 it was an important year, and I really wanted to write about that election period. And then I came to do the strike. But as I say, how to possibly show how many people have been involved in this strike, and that to have not only, say, a left-wing perspective or a striking miners perspective, but to have also the right wing, and also the right wing wasn't just the right wing was split, the left wing was split, to have all these competing narratives. And so it ended up being sort of 7 or so narrative voices telling what happened day by day throughout the year. And I realised that it is quite complex, but it's nowhere near as complex as it actually was, and I have simplified it.
La conexión entre...
The connection between the Red Riding Quartet, now that you were clearly mentioning it, and GB84 is precisely the elections and the Thatcher era in and of itself, with the world that was ending and the one that was beginning. And maybe things are worse now. I don't know what you think. The million-dollar question, what do you think about Brexit?
Well, obviously when I was writing GB84, I wasn't to know this, but all I would say is, first of all, the best lines in GB84 are not by me, obviously. Actually come from William Blake, which is, "A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state." And the areas in which this book takes place, the communities that were devastated by the miners' strike, the communities that were defeated, the communities I grew up in, were 70 to 80% overwhelmingly the places that voted to leave. And I have every sympathy for why they voted to leave. They were voting to leave because they'd been left behind by the form of global capitalism that has become dominant, to simplify things. Of course, there's an irony here in that what little money they did get to regenerate the mining areas has often come from the European Union. So there is an irony there. But these are areas that were devastated by the miners' strike, that Thatcher's crushing of the union and the decimation of that industry left them with nothing, like literally nothing. These places have, there are no shops, there are no pubs, there is just crime and drug addiction. That's all there is. And then when they're asked to vote, they will, and then in the years preceding the referendum, they were also the areas most widely and harshly affected by austerity. They were also the areas that often had to bear the most of the immigration, which the hospitals and schools and so forth are ill-equipped anyway to deal with the local population, and then cannot bear if more people come into the area. And so I really do understand why they voted to leave. And it is the Blake, it is in a way, to some extent, the revenge of what happened. I think it's because I really will stop in a minute, because otherwise it could just go on and on and on. But I think it's, you know, it's often portrayed as a you know, something that was, you know, these horrible characters such as Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage. These are the characters that appear all over the global media as the thing, but it's just missing. You know, it's missing a point here. And I also have, you know, growing up in the political environment I did, and coming from the left wing that I did, I have, you know, a great deal of sympathy for people who were not against Europe or the people of Europe, but were against the European Union that would then forbid a socialist government from nationalising the railways or taking gas, electricity and water back into public ownership. And the majority of British people want the government to run the railways, and they don't believe in the privatisation of their utilities. They don't believe in the privatisation of their hospitals, their schools or their prisons. They would like the state to do those things, and under the present way that the European Union is run, they would be forbidden to do that. So I have some sympathy for that, but and then this will be the last thing I'd say is, and so if we were leaving the European Union to enter a socialist utopia, I would be ecstatic, but we're not. We are leaving simply to save the Conservative Party, and the tragic irony is that the very people who have actually created that majority in these mining communities are the people that are once again are going to be most badly affected when we leave in the shambolic way that we will be leaving. And so they will be kicked and punched again as they have been. So that's that.
Es curioso que...
Well, I don't think it's worth clapping.
Yeah. Es curioso que para ver...
It's interesting that in order to see all of this clearly, or to start to really write clearly about everything and explain all of this, it's interesting that you had to be far away, because you started writing from Tokyo mainly, and actually you tried to go back to England, and you couldn't write so well in England, if I understood correctly, and you went back to living in Tokyo.
Yeah.
So what's your relationship with the distance? Why do you think you need all that distance to write, to see things clearly? Because in Tokyo, you're writing the Tokyo trilogy.
Yeah, I think that, I think certainly writing the Red Riding Quartet and GB84 and the Damned Unite, I think I really did need to be outside of Yorkshire or outside of England to do that. I just think I needed the physical distance and also the perspective, like the time I think that had passed. I think, you know, we talk about Brexit, but I can't believe that there are people writing Brexit novels now. I mean, it's this story's barely begun. I mean, I needed the time that had passed to write, say, something like GB84 or particularly the Yorkshire Ripper. Needed that. And I think, though, certainly at first when I was there, the lack of distraction, I mean, not having access to lots of English language books or newspapers and so forth, certainly, I mean, when I went back, it was not, I went back from 2009 to 2011. And there were many things that were really good on a personal level, but it was too distracting in a good way, really. But also, obviously, I say in a good way. Like for example, I could watch Sky Sports News, morning, noon, night if I wanted to. But I could go to the football games and things. I could, but also, you are then more caught up in the political emotions of the time, and really, I need the, and can't. I need some kind of space and distance with which to write the books, really. And actually, even now in Tokyo, it's like Tokyo is good because I have the room where I can write, and I can really try to shut myself off into the time and place because when I'm writing, what I'm trying to do is to write myself back into a time and place. So that in Tokyo Year Zero, for example, I was trying as much as possible to put myself into 1946 Tokyo after the war, and cutting myself off in that room to do that is what I'm trying to do. But with the invention of the internet, that becomes harder sometimes. Yeah.
Ya que ha mencionado el tema.
Since you mentioned that when you went back to England, you had the option of watching the football matches, how do the books, Red or Dead and The Damned United, how do they fit in your entire work? Because when you read them, you see clearly how they fit, because football seems sometimes even more criminal. There seems to be more crime there there seems to be more crime there than in the way normally a criminal inquiry is run. At least in the case of Brian Clough and the 24 Awful Days in the United and his gangster-like way of surviving in there.
I wouldn't describe him as a gangster, but actually I do see GB84, The Damned United, and Red or Dead, and then a fourth book as a kind of loose quartet, which actually is about the loosely and very pretentiously is a kind of questions about why a certain form of socialism passed away in the United Kingdom, and obviously the miners' strike is one part of that. Brian Clough was the working class, socialist football manager who did support the miners' strike and had these quite left-wing principles, but also then was involved in sort of dirty kind of money transfers and a certain kind of there is something about him that is to me represented it's a kind of symbolic of a way that Margaret Thatcher was able to gain a working class vote. I'm not saying that he didn't vote for her, I don't think, but he represents this kind of like where in the community I came from, there was this idea that you had to the working class has to better themselves, and the way to do it was instead. It was a kind of like, me and my family rather than me and my community. And whereas Bill Shankly in Red or Dead is the antithesis of Brian Clough, in that, he did this as, he saw himself as just, part of a collective. But it was he was doing this at Liverpool. He took Liverpool Football Club from nothing to being one of the most famous teams in the world. And I'm saying the phrase, he took it, but he would never say it as he. He was the catalyst. He was the catalyst who inspired people. The coaches around him, the ground staff, the players, but the fans. It was this collective, this very collective endeavour that they went upon, and I Red or Dead is the book that came. So we're missing out Tokyo Year Zero and Occupied City for now. Red or Dead was the book that came out of the 2 years that I was living in England from 2009 to 2011. At that time, I did a lot of readings and events for the trade unions in the north of England and at the working class library and working class in Manchester and things, and there seemed to me at that time a real yearning for a kind of old it's a kind of, I think it's a quite a peculiar, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me quite a peculiar kind of British form of socialist, which is as much from the church and the chapel as it is from Marx and Engels. It's a kind of like a socialist reading of, say, the Sermon on the Mount. It's as much a part of this. This is kind of where the church and the chapel played a lot in the early formation of the trade union movements in England. And there seemed to be a kind of hankering for this that I could really sense. And again, not to portray myself as Nostradamus, but I think it then was borne out a little bit by what happened with Jeremy Corbyn and the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, which I think hankers back to that too. And actually, Red or Dead was, a very conscious attempt on my part after the previous 8 books to write a book about a good man and a positive man, and to actually try for once to offer, a socialist saint, to offer something that actually shows a different way of doing things, a different way of living, rather than, I felt that for 8 books and most of my life I'd spent the time criticizing the structures of power, trying to kind of induce some kind of guilt in people who are never going to feel guilty. So, so I wanted instead really to offer some kind of, like that this man did this and inspired all these people, and they created this, and actually it's, the book itself is very, very long, and it's very, very repetitious, and I know that, but it's deliberately so, because actually that kind of socialism is hard work. It's repetitious. It's day by day, repeating the same things, living your life in that good way, day after day after day. And that is about only way that you will ever change anything. So that's the reason why the book is written like that. But that was my attempt at writing a happy story, apart from the second half of the book.
And if we now talk about Tokyo, before we finish, it is interesting how you chose, once you decide to speak of Tokyo, you again choose the role of a serial killer or a real case to explore that society, which was the occupied Japan after the Second World War. Did the story come first, the story of the killer, or you were interested in talking about occupied Japan and how to add other deaths that were not going to be investigated in this completely fractioned society of the time in Japan?
That's a good question. Now I can't. I think I was very conscious that I was living in I still live in the east end of Tokyo. It's an area that was destroyed first in 1923 by the earthquake, and then was destroyed again in 1945, in the spring of 45, by the air bombing, which completely devastated that part of Tokyo, and 120,000 people died in one night, and the buildings and the ashes of the dead filled in, Tokyo before the end of the war was actually constructed and made of many, many little canals. And actually all those canals now are gone because they filled them in with the ashes of the people and the buildings from that night. And but you're walking down these small, narrow paths and passages, but these are actually, if you look at the old maps, the canals where they were, and now have been covered over. And I was living there, and my children were, their mother is Japanese, and I was conscious that I didn't really know the history of the city as well as I would like for them to know the history of the city. I think so I wanted to when I write, like when I was writing about even the time and place I grew up, I write not because I know, because I want to know, because I'm asking questions of that time and place, and then I came across, or had even before come across, this case, the Kodaira case, which actually in itself was actually, until Tokio Year Zero was published in Japanese, it was actually, again, reasonably forgotten. But it seemed that this was, that this man, raped and murdered these women in, this city was bomb flat, was now, there'd been the defeat, the surrender, and now occupied. So, he'd started even before the end of the war, so 45 through to 46 he's doing this. The American occupation made no difference to him. In fact, the shortages and the lack of jobs and the lack of food was the very thing that allowed him to get the victims. He would promise them, he would promise them a job, or he would promise to take them to a place where they could get food. And that was how he, those crimes, he couldn't have done those things in any other time and place than that. And I thought then that was a way, I do see crime as a way to kind of like, in a way, unlock the door to step into that time and place. And that was, I think it was the combination of wanting to know the history and knowing, and then to understand that crime. And also, in this city where 120,000 people died, that there were these police, although a lot of the police in the book are portrayed badly, but there was certainly police who were trying still at that time to solve the murder of these women in the midst of all that had gone on. The way that people really were trying, and also the way that the people also changed or lost their identities and the construct. There were many things that were driving that book, and then similarly into Occupied City as well. Yeah.
¿Qué está pasando con la tercera parte?
And what is happening with the third part? Why is it so difficult to finish?
It's a question I've been asked a lot, actually. But,
Yeah.
It's. I mean, I am finishing it. I was writing it this morning, but it's no, I was. People are laughing, but I was. I think. I do think that there's just many things that happened that now, when I look back, I can see. The interruption of going back to, the biggest thing was actually this interruption of going back to live in England for 2 years, where I actually sort of thought, oh, well, it'll be better for the book to be writing it, I was able to write about Yorkshire and Tokyo, so it's going to be much better, but of course it didn't turn out that way. And then this, how the Bill Shankly book came about, and then this other book that was published last year in England, Patient X, which was, a series of short stories which began really as a kind of me trying to respond to the events of March 2011 with the earthquake and the tsunami and Fukushima. Because Akutagawa, the Patient X is a novel of tales based on the life of a Japanese short story writer who lived through the 1923 earthquake, and so it was. And the trouble with that was that I was writing these short stories intermittently about Akutagawa, but the trouble is that it sounds very pretentious or whatever, but I kind of. I'd summoned his presence and then kind of couldn't get. Akutagawa is the person whose quote begins Tokio Year Zero. He is the writer who inspired the structure of Occupied City with the different competing narrative voices. So he's been a big presence, but I felt that Patient X just had to come at that time. And then stepping back and forward to 1949, the period is, it sometimes takes a while to get yourself back into that place, really. But I hope it's better for having had a longer gestation period, really. Hopefully.
Seguro.
I'm sure it has.
Well,
Sí.
we'll see.
David quiere...
David wanted to do something to finish, which is reading for us to hear his voice. He wanted to read this mantra style in which he writes. He just wanted to read a section at the end of GB84. And yes.
Well, I was going to say, usually it's not a very good idea to read the end of a book, but but actually, I think we all know how this story turned out. So this is part of the end of GB84. Day 364. Mary's made a breakfast for us, packed us some snap and all. Like first day of spring today, beautiful. I follow Pete down welfare for 8:30. Nearly whole of village is out. Lot of emotion. Lads that have been sacked are going to push banner. In front of them, Pete and other Free Branch officials. Rest of us will fall in behind. I'm stood there thinking, don't cry and don't look for calf. Don't cry and don't. But I look around and see Big Chris with his handkerchief out. Soft bastard. Then we're off and I turn round. I can't believe how many there are. More than 50% still out. Easy. Makes me feel proud. Makes me feel sad to see us all here now, together, shoulder to shoulder, united, marching as one. Now it's too fucking late. Pete and them lot reach gates and call for a minute's silence for those who died during dispute. And that's when I see them. Not just the 800 stood with me now on Pit Lane, the support groups and all those that helped us, not just them, but all the others from far below, beneath my feet. They whisper, they echo, they moan, they scream from beneath the fields, below the hills, the roads, the motorways, the empty villages, the dirty cities, the abandoned mills, the silent factories, the dead trees, the broken fences, the stinking rivers, the dirty sky, the dirty blue March sky that spits down upon us now, the dead, the union of the dead, from Hartley to Harworth, from Sengendai to Satley, from Oaks to Orgreave, from Lofthouse to London, the dead that carried us from far to near, through the villages of the damned, to stand beside us here, together, shoulder to shoulder, united, marching as one, under their banners and their badges, in their branches and their bands, their muffled drums, their muted pipes that whisper, that echo, their funeral marches, their funeral music that moans, that screams again and again, forevermore, as if they're marching their way up out of the graves here to mourn the new dead, the country deaf to their laments, its belly swollen with black corpses and vengeful carrion rotting in its furrows. It waits the harvests that never come, the day weeping will burst forth and open the graves, the earth itself, and drown us all in their tears, in their sweat, in their blood, in our guilt and in our shame, until that day of judgment. There will be no spring, there will be no morning, there will be only winter, there can be only night. Lord, please open the eyes and ears of the people of England. But the people of England are blind and deaf. The armies of the night, the armies of the right. We are here because of you, they say, here because of you. And they strip us of our language and our lands, our families and our faith, our gods and our ways. We are but the matchstick men with our matchstick hats and clogs. And they shave our heads, send us to the showers, put us in their trains, stick us in their pits. The cage door closes, the cage door descends, to cover us with dirt, to leave us underground in place of strife, in place of fear, here where she stands at the gates of the head of her tribe and waits, triumphant on the mountains of our skulls, up to her hems in her blood, to the rivers of our blood, a wreath in one hand, the other between her legs, her two little princes dancing by their necks from her apron strings, and she looks down at the long march of labour halted here before her and says, awake, awake, this is England, your England, and the year is 0. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias a
Well, thank you all for coming. A pleasure having you. Thank you so much, David, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Continúa todo.
Thank you. Thank you.